G'day and welcome to episode 403 of The Other Side for the fortnight commencing Friday the 21st of February 2025. I'm Damien Curry, and this is a very special episode of The Other Side as we're coming to you from London, which is playing host to one of the most important events on the calendar every year for classical liberals and conservatives, the ARC conference. So ARC 2025 happened this week in London. What is ARC? It's the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, an annual powwow first developed and founded by Professor Jordan Peterson, as well as others, including Baroness Philippa Stroud, a member of the House of Lords of the UK, and Australia's own former Deputy Prime Minister, John Anderson.
The eternal message that's at the foundation of Western civilization is that we are each a divine locus of value. We each have a cardinal and irreplaceable role to play in the destiny of the world.
But as we have become separated from the source of why man is infinitely valuable, we've seen an unraveling of the pillars on which our societies are built, and a collapsing of the way in which we interact with one another.
More than 4,000 people have come from all over the world to attend this conference. No nation more represented per capita, though, than Australia, with almost 300 people attending from down under. Baroness Stroud opened the conference with a very stirring speech, asking the audience the rhetorical question, why are we here?
Why did we call? Why are we gathering? And why have you come from the nations of the world? Because those of us who love our nations and who love the principles and values on which it is founded know that there is something that is wrong. We know that the narratives and the stories that we are telling ourselves about who we are and about our future is damaging us. We are living through a civilizational moment. We are living through a social revolution, a complete experiment. We're living through an energy revolution and a technological revolution. And like in the days of old, we're coming together to decide what is to be done. It was Frodo who said to Gandalf, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the times that we are given."
ARC is a talk fest, yes, but the focus this year was on specifically defining what it is that makes the West great and what are the values that are worth defending and fighting for and upholding.
We will be asking, what are the ideas that have historically underpinned our flourishing? What was once self-evident but has been lost? What have we forgotten that we must remember? We're going to rediscover the values and virtues on which our civilization was built. The solid ground, the solid principles. An ethic based on freedom and human dignity, a culture committed to truth, and a people living with a secure identity, grounded by spiritual and philosophical foundations.
Baroness Stroud told the crowd that children have been told lies about our history and our culture in the Western world, and that's led to them not feeling the slightest bit proud of the societies or culture in which they've been born or are lucky enough to live. So much so that they also wouldn't fight to defend those cultures.
It was Marx who believed that by stealing a nation's history, you could steal that nation. At ARC, we believe it is time to claim back what has been stolen. We profoundly believe that the men and women gathered here will be those who rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. And that as we come together, we will strengthen one another for the task ahead. To end by drawing once again on Tolkien's inspiration. It was Gandalf speaking to King Theoden who said, "Perhaps your hands would remember their old strength better if they grasped your sword. It's time to remember, it's time to stand tall, and it's time to rebuild. Welcome aboard the Ark."
Well, have you got your thinking caps on? Because the next segment is kind of heavy intellectually, but it's worth the effort. Jordan Peterson gave his opening address at ARC this week, and it was really quite something. One of the most important questions, Dr. Peterson says, that people have got to ask themselves is, what drives us? He says if it's hedonism, if it's immediate gratification and pleasure seeking, then we're in trouble. That everybody needs to be motivated by a much higher purpose.
Hedonistic pleasure seeking, the gratification of immediate desire, the simple avoidance of pain or displeasure is not a principle that can improve when it's implemented or unite people in productive cooperation and competition so that a society can be established. The dominance of the personality by local, narrow, and self-serving whim is not a playable or noble game, and it allies itself necessarily with the force that cynics, like the postmodernists, like the neo-Marxists, believe is the only viable uniting force, that of power. If you're motivated by nothing but the pursuit of your own subjective desire in the moment, or your desire to avoid the necessary pain that mature conduct involves, you have to turn to power to impose your narrow will on others.
Peterson says turning to power to impose your will on others is the only option left open to us if we stay stuck in an immature, childish, hedonistic state, because everything just becomes all about us.
Why is hedonism wrong? Why is power wrong, technically? I think it's because both of those motivating forces or sets of motivating forces degenerate when they're iterated. You can't go through life like an immature 2-year-old because you can't sustain your own existence while pursuing immediate gratification in the present. And you can't sustain a society in a productive and abundant manner over the medium to long run if you use power to subordinate the will of others involuntarily to your desires.
Dr. Peterson says the reason that hedonism and the drive to power are immoral is that they degenerate over time. And he slammed the postmodernism and neo-Marxism that's infected Western academia and elites.
The skeptics proclaim that there's no uniting meta-narrative other than that of power. And that's wrong. There is a uniting meta-narrative.
Dr. Peterson says we're now in a position to explicitly understand and define that meta-narrative, that big story that defines Western civilization and defines our culture. And he says that could help us regain our faith in our liberal democratic systems and our Western societies. He says the core ideas in the big story are not selfish. They're actually very noble, and they primarily center around the concept of self-sacrifice.
Taken at face value, the dramas of sacrifice that are portrayed in our foundational texts have an impenetrable and opaque quality. What does it mean to offer something of value to the divine? It's a drama that's predicated on the realization that sacrifice is by necessity the foundation of civilization. Civilization is social and future-oriented, and that means, since it's social, that the individuals who come together to constitute society have to sacrifice their narrow, pleasure-seeking individuality, demanding gratification in the moment, for the sake of their mutual reciprocal relationships with others, locally first, in marriage, in family, in town, in city, expanding to province and state and country, nested all under the auspices, let's say, of the divine. That's a sacrificial process. It means foregoing the narrowly immediate for the sake of the community.
Maturity is about delaying gratification, not just hedonistically immediately satisfying our wants in the moment. Instead, it's about sacrificing the present for the benefit of the future and for the benefit of others.
When a child learns to make a friend, he learns necessarily the principle of sacrificial reciprocity. I have a turn, then you have a turn. I have a turn, then you have a turn. The sacrifice there is that it's not always my turn. And that sacrificial reciprocity is the foundational principle of the reciprocity upon which even the most primordial forms of society, friendship in childhood, let's say, are predicated. The foundational texts of Western civilization, the biblical texts in particular, are an extended study in the intricacies of sacrifice, predicated on the emergent discovery or realization that the sacrifice most pleasing to God, that sets the world right, that creates the order that is good or very good, is the sacrifice that tends towards the ultimate. And the Christian drama portrays the sacrificial process in its arguably ultimate form.
It's this idea of sacrifice, Peterson says, that's given Western civilization the ability to become wealthy and the ability to become powerful and to sustain and maintain and build upon those fundamental ideas of the West that have made it so successful.
And it's not just sacrifice. It's voluntary self-sacrifice towards the highest possible end. That's the foundation of civilization. The postmodernists be damned, which is virtually a certainty, by the way. Now, understanding this, I think, in a more explicit sense, to see that what we've been wrestling with for millennia is the movement towards the explicit formulation of the principle of voluntary upward self-sacrifice as the foundation of the community, as the foundation of abundance itself, as the precondition for the trust and reciprocity that enables us to compete and to cooperate so that we can produce societies that are endlessly productive.
Okay, that was profound. What he's saying there is that the left and the postmodern elites who like to dump on the West are completely ignorant of the fact that the West's success wasn't built on exploitation, but it had to evolve through sacrifice and selflessness to the societies that we now have, and that the abundance that we enjoy today is a result of that, not the exploitation of others.
The explicit understanding of the centrality of that principle, in my estimation, allows for the intelligent union of the traditional Western conservative with the traditional Western classic liberal. The hypothesis being that the stage is set for the emergence of the liberal individualism that we associate with the free Western world. The stage is set for the emergence of that ethos when the bedrock of reciprocal voluntary self-sacrifice is established and firm, and the conservatives stand for the self-evident foundation of Western civilization, and the classic liberals stand for its manifestation at the level of the individual. A manifestation which only maintains its validity when the underlying presumption of voluntary self-sacrifice serves as the proper foundation.
In other words, if we don't operate in the world with integrity and with honesty, we don't get the goodies long term. We might get them short term, but they definitely won't last. So what is this civilizational moment that we're living through anyway?
The civilizational moment is the opportunity that we have in front of us to wake up and to realize consciously and explicitly the nature of the dream that has enveloped us for the thousands of years of Judeo-Christian civilization. The sacrifice of self to the future, the sacrifice of self to the community as the necessary, inevitable, and revolutionary foundation of the civilization that makes us free and abundant. And so it's a core part of ARC's mission to get our story straight.
Peterson finished his address by saying that in the Free West, we've acted out the story and we've benefited from it. And now we have the opportunity to understand it and define it explicitly and fortify it, becoming a beacon to the rest of the world.
Thank you all very much for coming from all corners of the world to this conference.
You may have noticed if you've been overseas on holiday recently that you can log into your streaming services like Netflix or Prime in other countries, but the shows they offer are different and sometimes even better. You're paying good money for those subscription services. Why can't you watch? Well, with a virtual private network or VPN, you can log in from home here in Australia with an internet address from anywhere in the world, and big corporations and big government can't see where you are. Now, to be clear, criminals can still be actively found with police warrants, of course, but the average honest citizen will have their location protected from prying eyes of corporate marketers and government bureaucrats. If you sign up now with private internet access, we think they are the best VPN service out there. That's private internet access. As a viewer of The Other Side, you can get 83% off the price of your subscription and get online for less than $3 a month. Check it out right now. Go to piavpn.com/otherside. That's piavpn.com/otherside. It's a great service and a rock bottom price, and you're helping keep The Other Side going and growing.
You're watching The Other Side with Damien Coorey, Australia's best independent news commentary show, bringing you up to speed on the issues that matter most every second Friday. In between, don't miss The Other Side Unplugged, as Damien comments on current news and conducts in-depth interviews with the people who matter whenever the need arises. Simply subscribe for free on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button and bell, so you'll be notified whenever we post anything. And to really stay in touch, check out our independent website at othersidetv.com.au. You can sign up for free there too, or join the exclusive side and help support our show for less than $5 a month. This is The Other Side.
So some pretty high-level stuff there from Jordan Peterson in his opening address at the ARC conference in London this week. But what does that all mean for us mere mortals, and what does it mean for Australia? Dr. Stephen Chavura is one of Australia's leading historians and a lecturer at Campion College in Sydney. I had the great pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Chavura for a discussion on how all of this affects Australia at ARC this week. I hope you enjoyed this first part.
It's great finally to be on your show, Damien.
Good to have you.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the show.
Thank you. Appreciate that. How's ARC been for you so far, just in general terms?
Look, I've been having a great time. The talks have been stimulating. They've been interesting. Getting to meet people who I've read their books. I've seen them online, but I've never actually met them. So it's actually great. One of the things I love doing is going up to someone who wrote a great book, who wrote a courageous book or said something courageous, and going up and just thanking them.
Now, the US has got Trump. The UK has Reform, this new political party under Nigel Farage, which is outpolling, I think, in some polls, the Conservative Party now.
Yes.
Australia doesn't have... What's missing for us? Why do you think? Is it our system? What's your take on that?
It's probably a few things. I think that there's in a way, Australia just doesn't have the issues as badly as America and England does. So we've got immigration issues in Australia, but for example, our mass Islamic immigration issue has not gotten anywhere near as bad as it has in England, for example. And so that means any movement that's going to try and get a lot of traction on that issue in Australia is going to really, really struggle. Whereas they're doing much better in England because it's a much bigger problem. And it's probably also the idea that, in Australia, the ultimate, sort of the strongest power is held by parties. And, so we're never going to have a Trump figure who can just come in and do things like that. Although I will say, I was thinking about this the other day. Someone once asked me, could we have a Trump in Australia? And this is what I sort of have come to believe. It is that if we ever had one, and this is going to sound really strange, it was Gough Whitlam. Because Gough Whitlam comes in 1972 and just says, I don't like all these laws. And he and his deputy PM, Lance Barnard, form a sort of a duumvirate over 2 weeks. They take all the portfolios on themselves. And just like Trump is passing all these executive orders day after day after day, that's what Gough Whitlam and Lance Barnard did. They just passed all these new laws and did all these things, which ultimately, even though that their government crashed 3 years later, they changed Australia permanently. And so the weird thing is, if we could ever have a Trump, it was someone like Gough Whitlam. And part of me kind of says, something, maybe we need a sort of conservative Gough Whitlam government that isn't concerned so much about staying in power, but is concerned about fixing the rot in the time that they have.
Yeah. So, if you put my MBA hat on for a minute, we would call that breakthrough change instead of incremental change. Yeah. And organizations need that sometimes to really shake things up. And I think that's what a lot of commentators are missing about what Trump is doing and what Musk is helping him do.
Completely.
And we do need that, I think, in Australia because the bureaucracy has become so large.
Well, the bureaucracy has become an unelected kingdom within a kingdom. And you have the same thing in England as well. So, what happens in England when the English convincingly vote to exit Europe for breakfast? Brexit. I'm hungry. I missed lunch. That's why I said
Me
that.
Too.
Yeah. Well, they find that at every point they have to face hurdles put up by the English public service. And that's why it was such a painful, drawn-out process, because the English public service was basically throwing every roadblock in front. And you've got similar things in Australia. That's one of the reasons the immigration system in Australia has been so hard to reform, because the federal bureaucracy has made it very, very difficult. It's the same thing going on in America. Trump calls it the deep state. The deep state is not a conspiracy theory.
No, it's just a bureaucracy.
It's a bureaucracy that is unelected, that knows more than any individual politician. And so individual politicians find themselves enthralled by the collective knowledge of the bureaucracy, which makes it very difficult for them to do anything.
I was just talking to former Queensland Premier Campbell Newman, who's here also, about his time in power. Exactly that happened to him because he went in to do breakthrough change, he tried to reform, and then the machine just went against him. And of course, they convinced the public that he was completely evil when he wasn't, and that stuck, for a very long time. His own party, in fact, kind of abandoned him, I think, in to a large extent.
That's pretty sad. And just one thing we haven't mentioned is that the bureaucracy in England, in America, in Australia, it's left-wing.
Yes.
They're all creatures of the university system. They're creatures of the left-wing establishment institutions. And that is the big problem.
On top of the fact that by a bureaucracy's very nature, it's going to want to feed itself and grow itself in self-interest. Stephen, you're a deeper man than all of this. I want to get to some of the themes, the big themes, particularly Peterson's speech at the opening when he talked about sacrifice. Seemed to be a dominant theme there. Hedonism as being part of our culture now, that being an expression of immaturity, but we seem to have a lot of child adults running around in the West at the moment. Are we in they talk about the civilizational moment here at ARC, that seems to be the phrase. What does that phrase mean to you? What do those themes mean to you generally? Or how would you perhaps put that into an Australian context for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, Australia is an offshoot of British civilization. And, Australia is an incredible success story of people who came here against all the odds and built something really remarkable. It was a risk coming here. They nearly starved in the first 18 months when the Australian pioneers came here. They nearly starved to death. I don't want to sound like Trump talking about the Haitian immigrants, but they were literally eating dogs. They were eating rats. It's in the historical records. And so they had a pretty tough time, but they wound up building something through much blood, sweat and tears. And it's an amazing success story. But they did this because they believed in something. And it's not even just that they believed in themselves. There was this belief, and it lasts right up until Federation, that there is a sense in which this project that they were working on, which would become Australia, was something that was part of God's plan for history. They really thought that they were doing something that was sort of a manifestation of God's hand. They were a part of something so big, so meaningful, that all the pain, the death, the suffering, the risk-taking, it was all worth it. And I think that's what is dying in the West. This sense that what we are about in Australia, what they're about in America, in the West in general, is about something bigger than just us as individuals, something bigger than just the national GDP getting bigger and bigger and our economy's growing, but it's something cosmic. It's about this idea that there is a God, and that we are that we have duties not just to ourselves but to God himself, and that is the very meaning of life. It's embodied in Christianity, and that this is worth making sacrifices for. And so there's this debate in ARC. It's been going since the first ARC, and it is, do we need a revival of Christianity for a revival of what is best about Western civilization? Some say, no, we don't. We just need to believe in ourselves, and we just need to remain prosperous and keep our eyes on fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech and things like that. Then there are others, and I'm in this other camp, which say all these other things, like the respect for freedoms, respect for other people's freedoms, other people's rights, they all hinge on a prior commitment to a kind of meaningfulness of all the suffering and trouble and risk-taking that is required to build a civilization and maintain a civilization to begin with. And that meaningfulness is, in the case of Western civilization, Christianity. And Jordan's on that page as well. Jordan Peterson's on that page. I think Neil Ferguson's on that page. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is on that page. And the basic argument is, look, building a country, building a civilization is a very hard, painful process. It relies on a lot of sacrifice. And for people to go through that kind of pain and sacrifice and loss for something that they may not even themselves experience, it may be something for their children or their grandchildren or for people many generations down the track. it has to be meaningful. They won't do it if it's not meaningful. Get rid of all meaning, and yeah, it makes sense. Just live for pleasure, live for the now. But that's not how you build a civilization. And so for a civilization to be built, it requires a belief that this is part of God's plan. And
there does seem to be a bit of a revival occurring in Christianity globally, but particularly in the West, and particularly I've noticed in Australia.
Yes.
It would seem to me that people are searching for meaning. I'm wondering, though, for those viewers that aren't Christian or do not have that sense, and I appreciate what you're saying about the Christian ethic being particularly unique in its nature, in that it does require this sacrifice. It does require a non-hedonistic viewpoint, but also, I think, paints the narrative more appropriately, or perhaps better again. But for a secular audience, if someone's out there saying, well, look, I'm not into Christianity, what would be the way that they could look at this movement that we need to make and this direction that we need to go in?
What I would actually say to them is, I'm not necessarily going to try and convince you that Christianity is true, but what I would try to point out is that everything that you love about Western civilization, it occurred while Christianity was very strong. Christianity's decline has really happened very fast from the 1960s onwards. So what I would say is basically, you might not appreciate the account of Jesus and the gospel of Christianity, the good news about Jesus Christ. But what you have to appreciate is that the civilization that you want to see restored, it needs it. So even if you don't think you do, and I do think you do, in fact, the civilization does. So I'm not necessarily asking for you to jump on the Christian bandwagon, but understand that your civilization actually does need it. And perhaps actually when you do fully appreciate that your civilization does actually need it, your civilization includes you. And so at that point you might actually look within and start asking yourself, in fact, do I need what Christianity says I need, and that is a savior? And the answer is, yeah, you do. And if you can't believe it on the individual level just yet, at least see how it's true at the macro level, because look what's happening to Western civilization. It's going down the tubes. And when you recognize it on the macro level, come to see the truth of it on the individual level, which is that's a very academic way of saying.
Well,
in fact,
I think it's necessary, because I think it's academia that's been responsible for. I know in my journey, I mean, I've only returned to Christianity in recent years as a result of my exploration of ideas around the left. I didn't realize what was happening to me in the late 1980s as I was being educated in the system, which was very left-wing at that point. And it was almost a crime, almost a sin to mention religion. We scorned it. We saw it as anti-intellectual, as unintelligent. And partly, probably that has to do with a fairly inadequate Catholic school education that I had as well. But it was never presented to us at school or at university as having the richness of academic depth and cultural depth and intellectual depth that it does.
That it does have.
Yes. And I think that's the thing we've got to get back to. And if we don't, you're right. I mean, I don't think Western civilization can necessarily survive without some kind of acceptance of at least an allegiance to the Christian ethic.
Exactly. I mean, you can have civilizations without Christianity. We've had them all through history. But probably no one watching wants to live in something like the Carthaginian civilization, where babies are burned to death to satiate a god so the Carthaginians can have good crops and succeed at warfare. When people say they want to see civilization renewed, they're talking about a particular kind of civilization. It's not ancient Greek civilization. It's not ancient Carthaginian civilization. It's not even ancient Roman civilization. Most of us would not want to live in those civilizations. We're talking about a Christianized Western civilization with all sorts of rights and responsibilities and a particular conception of human beings that we have all come to see is the most true, good and beautiful way for a civilization to unfold, and we all come to enjoy it, but we're seeing it collapse around us.
And that's Professor Stephen Chavura from Campion College in Sydney speaking to me at the ARC conference in London this week. We'll have the second part of that interview a little later in this fortnight show.
The Other Side is Australia's best completely independent news commentary YouTube channel, bringing you up to speed and diving deep on the issues that matter most. Our fortnightly news catch-up and deep dive show, The Other Side with Damien Coorey, drops every second Friday night. And our new random The Other Side Unplugged content will appear whenever we have high-quality, meaningful content that matters to bring you. To keep producing and growing, we rely on support from ordinary viewers like you who care about the quality of news and commentary in Australia. The best way to support us is by becoming a member of the exclusive side on our website and contributing a small amount each month to the cause. You can do so for less than $5 a month, and we'll drop you an email when we post new content so you never miss a thing. Check out our website at othersidetv.com.au. That's othersidetv.com.au, or scan the QR code on your screen now with your phone camera. This is The Other Side.
Here in the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party lost the last election, losing 251 of the 365 seats they held in the Westminster Parliament right behind me. That was some whopping defeat, the worst for a political party in the UK in 120 years. And it's seen the emergence of a new political party called Reform. That's led by Nigel Farage, and it got the third highest number of votes. And since the election, Reform has just been going from strength to strength. It now outpolls the Labor Party and the Conservative Party, running at around 27% support compared to the other parties' 25 and 21% respectively. Now, this might explain why the new Conservative Party leader and opposition leader of the United Kingdom, Kemi Badenoch, had a very conservative lean to her presentation as the Prime Speaker at ARC this week.
Western civilization is in crisis. Our ideas and our culture have dominated the world for well over 2 centuries. This is not a crisis of values. It's a crisis of confidence that has set in at exactly the same time that we face existential threats. On the left, this self-doubt manifests as an embarrassment of the West's legacy, and in extremis, a hatred of Western history and even its culture. But what about the right? We know that the West has given the world amazing ideas and values, from democracy and free markets to our banking systems. Yet around us, we see so much cultural and economic decline, we doubt ourselves. We doubt our ability to build like our predecessors did. We doubt liberal values of tolerance or free trade, demanding a post-liberal world. It's not liberal values that are the problem. It's weakness. Last week, 2 surveys were released that should alarm everyone in this room. Almost half of young Brits think their country is racist. Nearly 60% of them are not proud to be British. Nearly 40% of the fighting age population wouldn't fight for our country under any circumstances. More than half of those aged between 13 and 27 said the UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge who does not have to bother with parliament and elections. A dictator.
So that is where our young are at. Similar surveys in the United States and Germany have shown similar results. And I reckon if we did a survey like that in Australia, it'd probably turn up exactly the same results at home as well.
I would say to those young people, I understand your anger, but be careful what you wish for. I was born in London, but grew up in a country with a military dictatorship and strong leaders who did away with pesky liberal values like democracy because people voted in bad politicians. They stopped free speech because some used it to offend. In the 1960s, many former British colonies in Africa decided to move on from British values. A lot of people preferred strongman politics and ethnic nationalism to democracy and pluralism. But when they got it, they didn't like it. Strong men had lots of words, but no plan. They ran everything and delivered nothing. They flogged teachers, shot journalists, people disappeared, dead bodies were found on the streets. Without the ability to speak freely or trade freely, the government controlled everything, and wealth became hard to create and easy to destroy. So let's remember what we are defending here. Not just our wealth, but our culture. A culture built on those values we've taken for granted. Classic liberal values, not left-wing liberalism, but classic liberalism of free markets, free speech, free enterprise, freedom of religion, the presumption of innocence, the rule of law and equality under it, no matter who you are or where you come from.
Kemi, Badenoch, the UK Conservative Party leader, speaking at ARC this week. She says the real problem with the left's grip on the young is that their ideology has absolutely nothing to do with kindness or freedom.
This is the real poison of left-wing progressivism. Whether it's pronouns or DEI or climate activism, these issues aren't about kindness. They are about control. We have limited time, and every second spent debating what a woman is a second lost from dealing with these challenges.
Badenoch says loopholes in liberalism that have been corrupted and manipulated by the left are at the heart of what's gone wrong.
We have been hacked. Rule of law is what built so much of the West. It is in the corruption of the rule of law itself that we see where the problems begin. The most extraordinary example is how the European Convention on Human Rights, designed to stop the persecution of individuals by the state, is now weaponized by those who wish to erode our national identity and border security. One case involved a man who was allowed to stay. It was claimed that his son disliked foreign chicken nuggets. In another, a drug dealer reportedly avoids deportation because of his daughter's gender identity issues. But we were members of this convention for half a century without this madness. What's changed? It's not the values, it's the people. They are afraid of creating any kind of conflict. They use the most novel and expansive interpretations of human rights law to avoid it. And we see that lack of confidence now in everything from law and order to national defense. A fear of sticking up for young girls being abused by rape gangs over so many decades so as not to upset community relations.
The UK rape gang crisis is so obscene that it's almost impossible to fathom. But what's even more impossible to fathom was that it was covered up for so long and allowed to continue for so long, all in the name of woke ideology and not wanting to cause offence. One of the main messages that Kemi Badenoch had for the crowd is that it's time for classical liberals and conservatives to no longer live on our knees, that we have to stand up, be strong, not weak, and speak out loudly. She says every one of us has got to rock the boat and play our part.
So how do we defend? Conservatives are the guardians of Western civilization. We do need to defend what we have, but many have forgotten how to do so. It requires bravery and not endless compliance at the threat of legal challenge. Millions of people all around the world want to live in the West because they want the benefits. However, some of them bring behaviors, cultures, and practices that will undermine the West and the values that helped make us great. They find common cause with our useful idiots who don't appreciate their own inheritance. And it starts by telling the truth. A country cannot be successful if its people and its intellectual elite don't believe in it. This means dealing with the poisoning of minds that is happening in higher education. We have been naive on economic growth. We have been naive on issues from net zero to immigration, weakening ourselves and strengthening our competitors.
Kemi delivered a very, very firm message on the problem of too much, too fast immigration. I really hope Peter Dutton was listening and taking notes, because if the Australian Liberal Party doesn't start to get stronger on issues, doesn't stop following the left and always being on the defensive, doesn't take the lead, then it will go the way of the UK Conservative Party. The UK Conservative Party now has to claw its way back from near oblivion just to remain relevant.
Immigration is far too high. We cannot support all those who wish to come to our country. We have no obligation to do so. The British people must come first. We cannot keep racking up debt for our children. It was fiscal weakness, not just war, that led to the decline of the Roman Empire. We need smaller government and smarter spending. The belief that the state and not business creates wealth has become normalized. The world owes no one a living. Millions of people cannot just sit on welfare and expect to be paid to do so. And if they don't like it, that's their problem, not the state's. Our country is not racist. We don't need to apologize. We don't need to pay reparations or give away the Chagos Islands. Free speech matters. Some cultures are better than others, and it's only contentious to say this because honesty has become impossible. People should not be afraid to speak out. We will be proud of our country. Most of all, we need to get up off our knees and start fighting, not just for the UK, but for the West and our values again.
And that was UK opposition leader Kemi Badenoch speaking at the ARC conference in London this week and explaining how she intends to bring her party back from the brink of annihilation. Once again, I hope Peter Dutton is listening. Now, someone who's not buying into this rebirth of the British Conservative Party as suddenly truly conservative is the leader of that Reform Party, Nigel Farage. He says that the Conservatives are just trying to cover up what their failings have been for the past 14 years that they were actually in government. And one of the funnier moments at ARC was when Mr. Farage was being interviewed on stage by Jordan Peterson, and he was asked a typically long-winded Jordan Peterson question, about 2 minutes long, which we've cut down for you here, and he got this reply.
I'm kind of wondering, you have an opportunity now, because the right is split in the UK, to really hash things out on the Conservative side. And this sort of thing happened a bit in Canada, and that means that it's possible now for Conservatives to push the envelope. And I'm really curious about your view on, it isn't exactly even on net zero, which I think is an appalling policy, to get that right out on the table. But more than that, it's like, how appalling is it?
Good morning, everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Old-fashioned upbringing, couldn't help it. First things first, the right is not split in this country. The Conservative Party is not on the right in any measurable way. 14 years that brought us the highest tax burden since 1947. 14 years that saw mass immigration, legal mass immigration on a scale hitherto never even dreamt of. 14 years that saw illegal immigration, small boats crossing the channel, and the government completely incapable of dealing with it because they couldn't face up to what membership of the European Convention on Human Rights was all about. And 14 years that saw net zero enshrined into law by a Conservative government and Boris Johnson, Theresa May, as evangelical.
The conversation then turned to energy policy and the terrible effect that net zero policies are having on the poor and working classes. Jordan Peterson pointing out that it may actually be time to once and for all end all discussion and debate on climate change. So questionable is the science, apparently.
The environmentalist climate scam was really an offshoot of the Club of Rome Malthusian stupidity that is predicated on the presumption that resources are finite and that there's far too many people on the planet, and there's a terrible anti-human motivation lurking underneath all of that that's pessimistic and brutal and genocidal in its fundamental ethos. And I think it's kind of time for people who would like energy to be inexpensive and reliable and there for the poor to just end it. It's like no more carbon apocalypse mongering and terrorizing. And so I guess I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, the one thing that drives me absolutely potty is when I hear that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. That's what they tell us. That clearly is absolutely nuts. Now, there are times in our past when CO2 in the atmosphere has been much, much higher than it is today, and that's before people drove 4x4 Chelsea tractors. And I remember having this debate about 20 years ago. There was a man called Sir Patrick Moore.
Yes.
Very famous scientist, The Sky at Night, great character, very respected man. And I said to him about 20 years ago, I said, Patrick, what do you think about man's impact on the environment through CO2? He said, well, it's impossible to think man doesn't have some sort of impact. He said, but when it comes to carbon dioxide levels and when it comes to warming and cooling, he said, let me assure you that sunspot activity and underwater volcanic activity will always have a bigger impact on the environment than man himself ever can, and I very much stuck to that view. That of all the CO2 that's produced every year in the world, only 3 to 5% of it is produced by mankind. So we do, as you rightly say, need to get this debate into a sense of perspective, and I sometimes think that the carbon dioxide hysteria has actually blinded us to other environmental disasters that are going on, such as the rape of our oceans and many other things. I'm an environmentalist in the old school sense and definition of that term.
I've reviewed a lot of scientific papers. Now, they're not climate papers, but I'm a reasonable hand at separating the wheat from the chaff on the scientific front. And when I look at the carbon data, there is one fact that leaps out to me in my experience with scientific data is that there's usually one or two major facts and a bunch of trivial sub-facts that more or less you can ignore. As far as I can tell, the most stunning effect of carbon, atmospheric carbon, that has been recorded scientifically is the effect of carbon on plant growth. Right. And we know this. Look, in the last 25 years, thereabouts, 20% of the Earth's surface is greened. 20% is a lot. And it's also primarily greened in semi-arid areas, because when you give plants more carbon dioxide, their stomata close, and so they can live where it's drier. And so the deserts are shrinking, not growing, which is exactly the opposite of what we were told was going to happen. And crop yields are up, something approximating 10 to 13%. So that's not bad. That's good.
Jordan Peterson speaking to Nigel Farage at ARC this week. The other side doesn't get more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money to bring you news from a centre-right perspective like the ABC does to bring you news from a left-wing perspective. In fact, we don't get a red cent from the government. We need voluntary donors and supporters like you to keep going and growing. And we hate asking for charity, so we've done a deal with what we think is the world's best VPN, virtual private network service. It'll keep you and your family truly safe without slowing down your internet speeds, and you can watch Netflix or other streaming services using your regular accounts with them as if you're viewing from any country in the world. And you can sign up for less than $3 a month and get a whopping 83% off the normal price. Just go to piavpn.com/otherside to sign up and get more info. That's piavpn.com/otherside.
The Other Side with Damien Coorey is Australia's best independent news commentary show, bringing you up to speed and diving deep on the issues that matter most in around an hour, with a new episode dropping every second Friday. As we enter our 5th year, we're going to be bringing you more content via our YouTube and X channels at Other Side Oz with The Other Side Unplugged. Damien will drop comments on the news whenever something important happens, and in-depth interviews with people who have real insight and value to add. More content when it matters, but only when it matters, so you don't miss a thing. Subscribe now to our YouTube channel at Other Side Oz by clicking the button and the bell below the picture frame. And follow us on X now at Other Side Oz. That's AUS at Other Side Oz. It's free. This is The Other Side.
Now to the second part of my interview with Dr. Stephen Chavura. Dr. Chavura is a senior lecturer and professor in history at Campion College in Sydney. We continued our discussion of religion and its importance in Western society, specifically Christianity, and then we moved on to a few other topics. I hope you enjoy this second part of our interview.
People like to condemn Christianity by condemning the church, and particularly my church, being a Catholic, and not to defend anything that went on in the Catholic Church, but certainly that was not unique to the Catholic Church, nor was it unique to Christian institutions. We also saw it in I covered a number of inquiries, royal commissions into governmental institutions and organisations that had very serious problems with child abuse in the same period. And I mean, we have to separate the institution from the religion. The institutions, which are flawed, of course, by their very nature, they're institutions of man. From the message of God, if you like, in the scriptures and in the ethic.
Well, my advice to anyone who's remotely sort of curious or even cynical is, okay, forget about. And this is a very Protestant thing to say, I know, but okay, forget about your own experience with a church. Go to the Bible. Pick up a Bible, read the book of Matthew or read one of the Gospels and just read about Jesus and just encounter Jesus directly in the Bible and take it from there. Your beef might be with the church. Okay, forget about the church for now. Just go to the main source, the Bible, and start reading it. Read the book of John or read the book of Mark, and just acquaint yourself with the man that it's all about. Start from there and see where it takes you. And I think, and I say this to everyone, reading the Bible regularly and praying for an open mind while reading the Bible, it is a transformative experience. If you don't like who you are now, and a lot of us don't like who we are now, start reading the Bible, pray for wisdom, and I think you will find it very transformative and just see where it takes you. Got nothing to lose.
Yeah. All right, well, we went fairly transcendent there for a minute, but just going back to...
From the sublime to the ridiculous. Let's go.
Back to history. Yeah. So one of the ways in which I think the left has corroded the sense that our young people, one of the statistics that bothered me a lot was the number of surveys that have been done in Western countries showing that young people don't appreciate what they've got. And I think that's because they've grown up in it. It's like a fish doesn't appreciate it's in water, right? They don't realise that nature is more like Game of Thrones than it is like the Western civilized world in which we live.
History is like the Game of Thrones.
Yeah, so we are very fortunate. The corrosion of the historical story of Australia, in a short version, I mean, I know you've done an excellent podcast on this recently that people can search up with John Anderson, but just in summary for other side viewers, how would you put that in a nutshell, the way that we've been taught this idea that we should be ashamed of our past?
Well, what we've been taught in a nutshell is that Europeans came over here with nothing other than an intention to make money and kill any Indigenous Australians who got in the way of that without any concern for their well-being whatsoever, and that nothing that the Europeans or colonisation has wrought Aboriginal Australians any good whatsoever, and that Aboriginal Australians would have been better off if we'd never come to begin with. And as a result of that, we should basically spend the rest of Australian history saying sorry and giving away land, giving away money to make atonement for everything. That's what they're taught in a nutshell.
And the correct version?
The correct version is that Europeans came over here with good intentions. They wanted to create an offshoot of British civilization, which was a much better way of living than many other countries in the world at the time, and that they naively, but I think in basic goodwill, hoped that over time the Aborigines would actually integrate into European civilization and enjoy the fruits of it. Now, when it started to become obvious that that wasn't happening, what many missionaries did with the support of governments was start missions to protect Aborigines from many white people who would want to hurt them, but also from many Aborigines who wanted to hurt them. We forget that most Aborigines were killed by other Aborigines in tribal warfare. This is something that students are not taught. Aboriginal tribes were notoriously bellicose. They were very prone to warfare. They committed genocide. Like, we want to call them First Nations people. Okay, fine. If we want to call tribes nations, then Aborigines were practicing genocide against one another before the Europeans came here. If that's what we want to say.
Yes, if we're going to call it a nation, then if you're killing the people from the other tribe, you're killing a nation. That's genocide.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I see.
There's documentary evidence of Aboriginal tribes wiping one another out. Now, we didn't like that, and there's no doubt there were massacres against Aborigines by whites and vice versa. So things did not turn out the way we wanted them to, but as much as we could over time, we tried to make amends. We tried to protect Aborigines from one another and from white people. And by the end of the 1850s, Aboriginal men in the colonies have the vote. They're allowed to vote. Aboriginal men and women are allowed to own property. That hardly sounds like something you would do for a people if you wanted to wipe them out. But they had property rights, they had voting rights. Now that gets a bit complicated a bit later on, but basically the story is one of, over time, an attempt to try as much as we can to integrate Indigenous Australians into the best of what European culture has to offer, and for the most part it has succeeded. 80% of Indigenous Australians are well integrated into mainstream Anglo-European culture today. There's about a 20 or 30% who are doing it really, really tough. They tend to live out in the regions, and the problem isn't racism that they're facing. The problem is there's all sorts of cultural issues within Aboriginal culture that doesn't help them, and they're living very far away from good services. So there are a bunch of things that are leading to their disadvantage, but it's not racism. And so the true view of Aussie history is not that things went perfectly, that things went often horribly wrong, but also there were very good intentions for most of it. And over the long period of history, the overwhelming majority of Aboriginal Australians today are actually living much better than they would have been had colonisation not taken place. 1/3 of them would have been killed at birth. Almost certainly. The elderly, many of them would have just been killed. Women would have been treated horribly, as many of them still are in these remote communities. In actual fact, life is actually much better now.
And that's assuming that nobody else came to colonise, and that there wasn't a World War I or II.
Well, as Nigel Biggar, as the great Nigel Biggar, Lord Biggar said, if the Maoris had come here before and taken over before the British, they would have killed killed most of the Aboriginal people here and enslaved the rest. That's what they would have done. If the Spanish had come here, God help them all. If the Belgians had come, God help them all.
Well, you know, Stephen, I spent 20 years travelling Asia, working in the corporate world, and everywhere that I went, the thing that I noticed after a few years was, if you were colonised by Britain, the systems and institutions and the functions of the society were quite positive. Still, if for those countries that were colonised by other European powers, not so much. So I think the British had something quite unique about them. As much as we like to rib the British in Australia, we ought to be grateful. I think that you know, they are our ancestors, and that they're, you know, there was a certain spirit to it. You've noticed a change, I hope, in the young. I mean, you're working, you're teaching, you're still a professor at Campion College, which is tell us a little bit about Campion College, actually, while we're at it.
Campion College is Australia's only liberal arts college. That is, you go to Campion College and you can get a degree at Campion College, which is as good as a university degree, a Bachelor of the Liberal Arts, and you will go to Campion, you'll study the great literature of Western civilization, history of Western civilization, the great philosophical ideas. You can study classical languages, you'll study theology as well. So it's an incredible grounding in Western civilization. And I'll just say it is not woke. Campion College is probably the least woke. In fact, it's not even, I would say, least woke. It's anti-woke. It is not a woke campus, so you can study these things and you're not going to be taught by rabid postmodernists and Marxists and just crazy people who want to get you to hate Western civilization, hate yourself. Campion College is a beautiful enclave of the study of all that is beautiful about Western civilization. It's based in Sydney. It's a private university. So I encourage anyone who's finishing year 12 to check out Campion College as an option to go to. Those who maybe just want to do 1 year and get a certificate in the liberal arts, you can study ancient history, philosophy, literature, some theology for a year. Come and check out Campion College. It's a fantastic place to teach. So that's what we do at Campion College. And yeah, I think one of the game changers is the internet. See, when you and I were school kids and at university, there was really no place to get alternative ideas. You had what was there in the school library. You had what was there at the university library. That was pretty much it. And so if your lefty teachers or your lefty academics didn't want to get any conservative or contrarian books in, they didn't, and that's all you had access to. Whereas nowadays they've got access to the internet. There are so many resources that younger people are accessing now, and they're able to actually challenge their teachers and say, wait a second, you said this about Australian history, but in actual fact, I just watched this 1 hour interview with John Anderson, and he got a couple of historians on, and they showed the evidence that what you've just said isn't true. And so you have that now. You didn't have it back in our day. And so there's a pushback emerging from sort of Generation Alpha and Generation Z right now. And so I'm really hopeful about the future, because I just think the internet is a game changer. And
yes, for all its ills, it brings a lot of positive stuff.
Absolutely, which is one of the reasons I was against the government banning of social media for under 16s, because that is making it more difficult for under 16s to access information that goes against the narrative they're getting in schools, universities, and from the government. So I was very much opposed to that, as I'm sure you were as well.
There are a few people speaking here at ARC about the need for that. There is a strong push. Certainly there's a need to get kids off their phones and interacting more. And I think there is a dopamine anxiety issue going on here. Also social, interactions between teenagers and things like that. But I think when we were on Sky News one night, you said, I believe there should be restriction, but it ought to be coming from parents, not the state.
Absolutely. I don't think most kids below 16 should be on social media, but that's for their parents to sort out. Once the government starts intervening in that, that's when the bans will start to get a little bit broader. It'll start to broaden out. And again, it's a classic instance, and no one's spoken about this other than really you and me, I think, that this is literally the government banning under 16s from accessing a whole bunch of good information that they're just not going to find very easily elsewhere. And that's not a path that we want to be going down.
We're yet to see how it can be implemented. So it may, again, as some of the more cynical people would say, and probably wisely, we need to keep an eye on whether this is really about just IDing everybody more than it's about
for sure.
Kids.
Completely agree with you there. Yeah.
Stephen, thanks so much for your time. Really do appreciate it, and I better let you get back to the conference.
My pleasure, Damien. Love to come back on the show again.
Love to have you. Thanks a lot.
And that is all we have for this special episode of The Other Side, coming to you from London for the ARC Conference 2025. And we'll have more clips and interviews and segments based around some of the presentations from ARC for you on The Other Side Unplugged in coming weeks. So please do make sure that you hit the subscribe button on YouTube if you're not subscribed already. That helps us enormously, and the little notification bell, because that will ensure that you get notified when we do post the unplugged content. And our unplugged show doesn't come out on a regular time basis, so it can come out anytime. So it's good to be signed up for those notifications. An even better way to sign up, of course, is to jump over to our website at othersidetv.com.au, and please sign up to get our regular emails when we post major content. That's free. And you can support the show. We really do need your support, because we are totally funded by the support of our viewers. So please get on. If you did feel you get a dollar or so worth of value out of the show, you can sponsor us for as little as $5 a month or more if you're feeling generous. So please do that now. Jump onto othersidetv.com.au. Thanks very much, and we'll catch you on March the 7th, Friday, March the 7th, next fortnight, for our fortnightly main show, The Other Side. We'll see you then.
The Other Side with Damien Coorey is Australia's best independent news commentary show, bringing you up to speed on the issues that matter most every second Friday. In between, don't miss The Other Side Unplugged, as Damien comments on current news and conducts in-depth interviews with the people who matter whenever the need arises. Simply subscribe for free on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button and bell, so you'll be notified whenever we post anything. And to really stay in touch, check out our independent website at othersidetv.com.au. You can sign up for free there too, or join the exclusive side and help support our show for less than $5 a month.